Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur. In this lecture, I will be talking to you about the correlation of bilingualism and multilingualism with memory. We are going to discuss what are the different configurations of memory that have been thought about with respect to bilinguals, given that they have two fully developed systems of language, two fully developed lexicons, and words of two languages which are coexisting within the same person. Now, one of the very crucial mental faculties that is implicated in bilingualism is memory. More specifically, since bilinguals and multilinguals have two fully developed lexical systems, it is certainly interesting to know as to how they would organize the word forms and word meaning information in their memory. Also, questions could be asked about how does retrieval work, given that for each concept they would have multiple candidates from within the same language and from across the languages as well. Now, one of the first attempts at understanding language organization in bilinguals was made by Weinreich in 1953, where he makes the distinction, a very important theoretical distinction between two levels of representation in bilingual memory. The two important aspects in this description were the signifier, or the mode of expression, which denotes the word level or the lexical level, and the signified, which basically denotes the meaning or the semantic level representation of the concept denoted by a word. For example, if you look at the picture of an apple and if you look at the word apple is the signifier and the concept of the apple is actually the signified. So the word apple signifies the concept of this fruit apple. Similarly, the word save signifies the concept of this fruit save. In bilinguals, this is basically a very interesting mapping to see, because there are two signifiers and one signified possible, or say for example there are multiple signifiers possible and with a single signified. Now, three types of bilingual representations were proposed in Weinreich's system. First is the coordinate system. In the coordinate system, the cognitive architecture for the two languages would be independent both at the signifier and signified levels. So there will be a signifier and signified for the first language, and there will be a signifier and signified for the second language, and the definitions of the two words from the different languages would also be essentially deemed to be different and would represent meanings that are unique to the respective language. For instance, as a Hindi-English bilingual, the word pustak and book may mean slightly different things to me and would be associated with different language-specific information. On the other hand, the compound system proposes a single or joint signified and two signifiers for the bilingual's two languages. Thus, for an Hindi-English bilingual, the concept of pustak and book, the two signifiers will be linked together to the same signified, that is the mental representation of a book. This is another very interesting way of looking at how memory will be organized in bilinguals. On the other hand, in a subordinate system, what you would imagine is that in a bilingual's memory, the words or the signifier from the L2 will be connected to the signifier from L1, and this signifier from L1 will actually be connected to the semantic conceptual representation. So technically, for a word from for a signifier or a word from L2 to be able to reach the signified or the mental concept, it will have to go through the L1. Basically, you can think like you will have to constantly translate from your L2 into L1 in order to understand what that word means and in order to provide access to the semantic conceptual system. Now, in posing these distinctions, Weinreich was the first to distinguish between lexical and conceptual levels of representation. However, more importantly, he actually postulates a memory structure wherein L2 learners must progress through a series of stages before they become fully functional in their two languages. Interestingly, as the bilingual gets more and more proficient in their two languages, the organization of the memory would change progressively as well. For instance, to become a fully functional bilingual, L2 learners would first need to link every word of L2 to the translational equivalent of L1 and establish the relationship with the concept. So basically, you need to start with a subordinate level to go to coordinate and the compound level eventually, as with increasing proficiency in L2 happens. Now, this interesting distinction that Weinreich has made between the coordinate and compound bilinguals, in the sense that this distinction incorporates the modifications of the bilingual's memory structure based on how and where the two languages of a bilingual are learned. Technically, you can see that the subordinate level is the slightly lower level or initial level of learning an L2, but coordinate and compound levels are two qualitatively different levels, although technically they are serving the same function. For instance, if you look at the structure of the system, whether it is a compound or a coordinate system, it would actually depend upon the context of L2 acquisition. So what basically we are saying is whether a bilingual will have a compound system of memory organization or a coordinate system of memory organization, it would basically depend upon where and in what circumstances the L2 has been learned. Now, as a person learning their, say for example, as a person who has learned their L1, which is Spanish, let's say in Mexico, and the L2, which is English in the United States, would be likely to develop a more coordinate representational system where the mappings between signifier and signified will be very different in Mexican and very different in English, and these two systems will not really interact too much with each other. However, the same organization can also arise in scenarios where the L1 is learned at home and the L2 is learned at school or at work, and there again you can see that the signifier and signified are actually developing fairly independently of each other, and they are not linked, and therefore leading to a coordinate sort of a representation. In other words, when each of the different languages is learned in different places, taught by different people under different circumstances, these differences become the basis of the distinction between the manner of the organization of memory. In contrast, if the individual learns the two languages in a situation in which both languages are spoken simultaneously by the same people in the same context, then the learning individual would be more prone to developing a compound structure, because both these signifiers have actually been linked to each other as well as they have been linked to the signified. So learning an L2 through direct association or by associating every L2 words to its L1 translation equivalent would actually give rise to this kind of memory configuration. Now, looking at this theoretical distinction that has been made between the coordinate and compound bilinguals more closely, let's look at the pros and cons of this kind of model. Firstly, as a general model of bilingual memory, this theory actually implies that during language learning, bilinguals actually encode linguistic information in a context-specific manner. How am I learning this information? Where, in what context I am learning this information? And also where and how this information has to be used. And therefore, this information will actually be stored in a manner according to which it was learned. So any differences or similarities that exist during the learning process would reflect in the nature of the concepts themselves and would reflect in the organization of those concepts in the bilingual memory also. For example, abstract words and concepts that are more likely to exhibit language-specific characteristics with respect to their usage and overall meaning are typically encoded in a coordinate fashion. Say, for example, if you are learning the names of emotions, etc. in your first language, you'll probably learn them independently of your second language without a lot of interaction between the two. Other words such as cognates, which are common across the two languages and share orthographic and semantic representation across the languages, will be encoded in the semantic memory in a coordinate fashion regardless of when and where the learning process has taken place. So you can see the manner of learning, or as well as the manner of the content of what you're learning, decide how the eventual memory organization would actually shape up like. Now, in this context, the coordinate and compound distinction could actually be useful when a bilingual memory configuration is described based on the degree of semantic overlap between words across languages. So, when you're talking about languages which are very similar to each other, say for example Dutch and Deutsch, so the language that is spoken in Germany versus the language that is spoken in Netherlands, as well as parts of Belgium, which is Flemish, they have a lot of overlap between each other. So, if there is a lot of overlap amongst the words of each languages, then you can basically expect a sort of a compound kind of an organization of memory, because all of these words are automatically connected to each other. However, this model becomes slightly more difficult to defend as a general model of bilingualism because it does not really talk to us a lot about how L2 is learned and organized, especially in cases when the bilinguals could actually achieve higher proficiency levels in their L2 and their L2 actually becomes the dominant language. Now, this could be the scenario that a lot of us would be going through, because because a bunch of us would have gone to English medium schools starting, when we started school, and eventually due to our place of work or our, line of education, the medium of education that we have been imparted with, English somehow becomes the more dominant language as opposed to Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Bangla and so on, because more often than not we are speaking in English rather than in our first language. Now, interestingly, studies supporting this coordinate compound distinction that do not really provide a lot of evidence in this, in support of the same, may basically be telling us about the underlying differences in the nature of representations as well. Let us look at this in more detail. So, another way of looking at the compound coordinate bilingual distinction was by hypothesizing shared versus separate memory organizations, which actually has been a very influential view with respect to organization of bilingual memory. Now, according to this view, bilinguals either organize their two languages into a single shared memory store or into two separate memory stores where each of these languages are organized differently. You can remember some of the earlier models like the BIA, where you had two separate language nodes which actually were linked with words of that same language. Now, typically, experiments that have followed this line of inquiry have made participants learn bilingual word pairs such as house, casa, or monolingual word pairs such as home, house, and then when they were later tested either through a free recall method or a recognition task, and in some cases they were also asked to generate these word associations. Now, experiments that actually demonstrated language differences during retrieval were taken as an evidence for the two memory organization system, whereas failure to remember was taken as an evidence, or failure to remember these language pairs was taken as an evidence supporting the one memory system. Because if there is one memory, the two spaces would sort of mix with each other and will be more difficult to recall, whereas if there are two separate memory systems, then house and casa will be actually, they will not interfere with each other and remembered much easily. Interestingly, both these models have, the shared memory model and the separate memory system model have actually garnered some empirical support for themselves. And if you sort of take a step back and see this entire mixed results actually prompted the researcher to conclude that bilinguals neither had separate nor shared memory systems exclusively, because information that was encoded in a very language specific way could also be accessed by both the language systems. So in some sense it could be somewhere in the middle, and typically what we have to assume is that information that is learned through either language system is still accessible through a common conceptual store to both the languages. Now, since we are reviewing different types of possible memory organizations for bilinguals, another one that we could talk about is basically the system where you're talking about bilinguals in terms of processes rather than the nature of representations. Now, according to the processes view, the mixed results that are obtained with respect to bilingual memory are primarily because initial studies failed to take into account the task demands. Now, the argument was that the evidence for one or two memory systems hypotheses actually depended upon the types of tasks that were employed in these studies. So, if you take a particular kind of task, you will see evidence for a single memory system. If you take another kind of task, you will see evidence for a dual memory system or a shared memory system. Now, for instance, recall tasks that were sensitive to semantic and conceptual processes would yield results consistent with shared memory model, and those that were sensitive to perceptual and lexical processes would yield results that favored the language specific or two memory model. Yeah. So the dual coding model basically postulates independent memory stores for bilinguals different languages, although these storage systems may be thought of as interconnected. So the L1 verbal system would contain language information relative to L1, and the L2 verbal system would contain language information related to the L2. These verbal systems are considered highly specialized for processing linguistic information and for generating speech. Now, the model also makes a distinction between concrete and abstract logogens that you saw in the figure just now, and these abstract and concrete logogens can be thought of as lexical representations that derive their meaning from contextual connections to both verbal and non-verbal representations. Further, although the verbal systems are relatively independent, you saw that they are linked by the V1, V2 connections, which can be thought of as mapping of the translational equivalents in the two languages. Also, according to this model, the translation equivalents and synonyms are more likely to share a common image representation. However, shared images across the languages are more readily available for concrete than for abstract words. Remember, I was talking to you about that abstract concepts, emotional concepts, etc., are less translatable to each other, and therefore they might not have direct correspondence between translation equivalents. But for concrete objects, say for example bottle and book, etc., there is a higher possibility of having translation equivalents which are mapped together to the same signifier, signified. Now, both these verbal systems are supposed to be connected to the common image system, which is highly specialized in processing spatial, perceptual or visual information concerning non-verbal objects and events, and for generating images for such events. So if you are basically seeing some new experiences, this image system will be able to generate images for this, and these images or the mental representations that govern these images would resemble the perceived objects and scenes that they represent, and they will be correspondingly mapped to the different verbal systems. Moving on, while the image system can function independently, it is also connected to both verbal systems via V1I and V2I links, and consequently the verbal and the image systems are able to mutually influence each other. So, the concrete logogens from the L1 verbal system basically is able to influence the activation of the translation equivalent in the L2 verbal system, and in other words, you can see that the verbal and image systems may influence each other in such a way that verbal activity in either of the systems, L1 or L2, can be influenced by the image system and can influence the image system vice versa. So, this is how the conceptual organization of memory would work. If you are seeing something and an image of that is generated, the image can actually prompt verbal candidates in both L1 and L2 systems, or it could happen that this prompts a candidate in L1 system, and which would by virtue of its connection to the L2 system will prompt a candidate there as well. So depending upon whether the bilingual structure is coordinate or compound, or depending upon L1 and L2 language experiences, the imaging system would actually contain language dependent images or language specific images across the two different verbal systems. Such an organization has actually been able to account for a bunch of findings in the bilingual experiments, showing language dependent effects among bilinguals learning their L1 in their own home country and L2 in their second one. For example, one of the effects that this bilingual dual coding approach accounts for is the bilingual concreteness effects. According to this, concrete words are recalled or processed faster than abstract words because of the virtue of their inherently high imagery, using which they can be encoded using the verbal and image systems for a total of 2 codes. So if I'm showing you a picture of an apple or a bottle or a box, it has a very high imagery. It can basically generate images very quickly in the image system, and correspondingly generate verbal candidates from both the verbal systems very fast. That is why the concreteness effect actually says that concrete words will be recalled faster in bilinguals both languages as opposed to abstract words. Another finding that the bilingual dual coding theory can account for is the between language memory effect. Now in this finding, what happens is memory retrieval for remembering is much better for conditions in which participants are asked to study bilingual word pairs, for example love and amor in English and Spanish respectively, than for learning conditions in which participants are asked to study these concepts in monolingual ways, say for example love and amor and amor separately. The model basically explains these effects on the basis of the fact that bilingual word pairs are very likely to benefit from multiple codes. Say they will have a code in the L1 memory system, L1 verbal system, as well as the L2 verbal system, and both of which will be mapped to the image code as well. So, and monolingual word pairs are less likely to benefit from multiple codes because they will have a single code, and therefore between language memory effect will be much more stronger, and words that have candidates in both verbal systems will be recalled faster and better. Another effect that is very well explained by the bilingual dual coding approach is the picture superiority effect, which can be explained on the basis that bilingual dual coding account that pictures are remembered much better than words as measured by conceptually driven tasks. They would very quickly generate the images for both bilinguals and multilinguals, and they would basically be able to reach to both verbal systems or a single verbal system as per the demand. command, and therefore pictures will be much easier to name as opposed to words. Now, moving on from the bilingual dual coding approach, let's look at some of the hierarchical models of bilingual memory. Now, these models of bilingual memory actually assume a structure wherein the bilinguals actually organize their languages in separate lexicons and one conceptual system that is shared by two languages. At the lexical level, the bilingual's two lexicons representing each language are separate and they contain information specific to each language. However, the conceptual system is shared and it contains general abstract information about the world that is language independent. So, two kinds of hierarchical models can be talked about. First is the word association model, which proposes that a bilingual memory architecture wherein bilinguals two languages interact at the lexical level based on translational equivalence. According to this model, the bilingual's L2 is subordinated to the bilingual's L1 and everything needs to be first translated into L1, and L1 is the connection that can only reach the conceptual store but not from L2. You can see the figure here. You can see that this is the word association model, where you can see every word from L2 needs to be first translated to L1, which has direct access to or direct connection to the conceptual or the semantic store. However, there is another model which is the concept mediation model, in which you can see that both L2 lexical store and L1 lexical store have direct access to the conceptual store, which, as I said, is language free. So, the concept mediation model actually assumes that the bilingual's two languages operate independently from each other, much like in the coordinate distinction that we were talking about from Weinreich. And more importantly, both these lexicons are imagined as operating independently from each other, but they are both connected to the conceptual memory store. So, according to Potter and colleagues, the native and non-native languages of a bilingual would operate independently so that words are not associated interlingually, so translation equivalents are not connected to each other, but instead words in each language are associated directly with the non-linguistic conceptual system, which can sort of link the words from both languages if the signified is one and there are two signifiers. An important aspect of these models is the assumption that the L2 lexicon would be much smaller than the L1 lexicon, which is because a bilingual is supposed to know more words in their native language than in their second language. Again, this is a reasonable assumption, and therefore this model sort of makes a lot of sense. Now, according to Potter and colleagues' initial findings, the experimental studies supported the concept mediation model as opposed to the word association model. Potter and colleagues suggested that words of a second language were actually associated with words of a first language by a common conceptual store and not by direct association between vocabulary models. Because if you have to translate everything from L2 to L1, it would actually make the speed much slower, and it is much easier for a top-down thing to happen, that the words from L2 are connected to the conceptual store, and then from the conceptual store they are connected to the candidates of L1. So, other evidence actually suggested that the word association model described a bilingual structure corresponding to bilingual at very early stages of L2 learning, wherein actually they associate every L2 word with a translation equivalent. And in contrast, the concept mediation model actually described a bilingual structure that corresponds to bilingual with high proficiencies in their both in their L1 and L2. So you can see which of the models is more plausible, or you can basically say that one of the models is more plausible at an early stage of bilingual learning and the other model is more plausible at a later stage of bilingual learning. Now, other more important finding that were demonstrated using bilinguals was that they translated faster from their L2 to L1 than from their L1 to L2. Now, this translation asymmetry actually held for early and advanced bilinguals, and neither the word association or the concept mediation model could completely account for this pattern of results. So, all in all, Potter's bilingual hierarchical models actually provide a relatively clear and sound theoretical alternative to the then prevalent single memory or two memory systems that were talked about, in the dual coding approach and other approaches. However, the proposals that bilinguals organize memory at different levels, that is lexical versus semantic, was actually first conceived of by Weinreich, and the critical distinction between the signified and signified actually is very critical in some of these later models as well. Moreover, Potter's word association and concept mediation models are actually reminiscent of Weinrich's subordinate and compound bilingual models, respectively, which, if you are following the lecture attentively, you would have seen already the links between the two. Now, whereas Potter's concept mediation model represents a logical and natural structure of bilingual memory representation, the compound bilingual structure actually reflects more of a learning strategy, emphasizing the manner in which the bilingual two languages are learned. So there are these qualitative differences, however, although they seem very similar. The word association and the subordinate bilingual structure, on the other hand, hypothesize similar learning process and similar memory organization in early bilinguals. Now, just to go in more detail, this model actually proposes that the configuration in which wherein the bilingual lexicons are bidirectionally connected, as we saw, the lexical link represented by the solid arrow from the L2 to L1 is stronger than the L1 to L2 link depicted by the broken line to reflect the way that L2 was learned, because L2 was typically learned on top of L1 and not in the other way around. So, following that, during L2 acquisition, bilinguals do associate initially every new learned word in their L2 with their equivalent word in L1, forming a lexical level association that remains active and strong throughout. Thus, for a Spanish active native speaker whose L2 is English, translating from Spanish to English would actually be much faster than translating from English to Spanish, because every L2 word is mapped onto its L1 equivalent, but not vice versa. Now, according to the revised hierarchical model, the bidirectional conceptual links between the lexicon and the conceptual store are there. Now, these strong conceptual links actually exist between the L1 lexicon and the conceptual store, represented by the solid bidirectional arrows which we just saw. Now, this relatively stronger connection actually denotes the special status of L1 or the native language in associating word concepts. Because, say, if you are a sequential bilingual, and we've talked about this in the past lectures as well, you would have acquired your understanding of the world, you have acquired so many concepts in your first language, and it has happened much more solidly while the brain was maturing and so on, and therefore these connections will be very solid and they will stay till the end, as opposed to slightly relatively weaker connections in the L2, which you probably have acquired later if you are a sequential bilingual. However, just to sort of highlight, this might not be the case if you have learned both the languages at the same time and you are a simultaneous early bilingual. Now, that's basically what follows. So, the conceptual links between the L2 lexicon and the conceptual store are depicted by broken lines, bidirectional arrows, and therefore are supposed to be relatively weaker, reflecting the bilingual's inability to directly access the words, access the conceptual store from the words from the L2. Again, you basically don't have to get lost in a lot of jargon, but just see how is a bilingual learning the two languages and how is their learning of the two languages going to impact the organization of their memory. Now, further, access to the conceptual store from the L2 would actually be faster and more efficient via the L2 L1 link rather than from L2 to conceptual store link, because this link slightly would appear weak, and even for bilinguals with high proficiency levels in L2. In the original study, Crowell and Stewart actually tested Dutch English fluent bilinguals and asked them to perform backward and forward translations on categorized and random lists. The authors actually sought to investigate whether translating categorized lists, which involve conceptual processing, would interfere with slow down forward translation as compared to backward translation, which assumed to be unaffected by semantic variables. So basically, you would have lists of fruits and animals and tools, or you could have a random list which contains all these kind of things. If you are going through categorized list, you are probably going through the conceptualized store and then doing the translation. If you are going to the mixed link, then you are not being able to discover any discernible pattern, and you will basically go through the L2 to L1 link and then do the conceptual store. So this is basically what is happening. However, when you're doing backward translation, it would be expected to be faster than forward translation in the randomized list condition. Now, the results actually favored both these hypotheses. Forward translation was indeed influenced by the changing semantic context of the list, and it took longer to translate the categorized lists of words from L1 to L2 than to translate randomized lists of words from L1 to L2, because of those links. In contrast, no difference in backward translation was actually found across the two lists. However, for the randomized word list condition, backward translation was significantly faster than forward translation as predicted by the revised hierarchical model. So you can actually see that when the L2 words have to go through the conceptual store via the L1, they are actually faster than when they have to go through directly to the conceptual store. Now, the revised hierarchical model is also supported from experiments reporting asymmetrical cross-language priming effects. Now, what is cross-language priming? Cross-language priming is actually a phenomena during which a word in the L1, say for example Gera, is responded to faster when it is preceded by a related word, let's say through some association or semantic relation in the L2 piece, for example. Or a direct translation, which is translation priming in the L2, for example, war. Then when it is preceded by a non-related or a non-translational equivalent, so cat or gato. Now, in general, cross-language priming is actually obtained, but only if L2 target is preceded by a related rather than an unrelated L1 prime in translation priming and cross-language priming. However, no cross-language priming is actually obtained if the critical prime is in the L2 and the target is in the L1 for translation priming and association priming. So you're basically seeing that this asymmetric priming effect is observed. And this basically suggests that accessing the L2 target from the L1 prime is conceptually mediated because it is achieved via the conceptual store, which is the locus of semantic priming effect. In contrast, accessing the L1 target from the L2 prime actually takes place only at the lexical level and therefore produces no significant cross-language priming. Notably, contrary to the predicted asymmetries in the backward and forward translation, these effects are differentially sensitive to the lexically and conceptually driven effects, and some findings actually suggest that both translation directions involve conceptual access and are sensitive to semantic processing. So there are these mixed explanations that are emerging. Similarly, reliable cross-language priming effects have also been observed for the L1 to L2 and L2 to L1 language directions in the translation priming and cross-language associative priming. Also, the hypothesis that during the early stages of L2 learning, access to conceptual memory is primarily mediated by the strong lexical links between L2 and L1 lexicons due to the relatively weak conceptual links between, has also been called into question. So again, while we see that some initial studies support, the postulation of the revised hierarchical model, there are also results that call these, predictions of the model into question. For example, Altariba and Mathis were able to show semantic interference effects for novice learners of an L2 and therefore concluded that both lexical and conceptual links are formed at the very beginning stages of learning a new language, and it does not have to go through the L1 translational equivalents. All in all, the revised hierarchical model is relatively limited and lacks clear mechanisms to reflect the dynamic nature of the interaction between a bilingual's two languages, especially especially with respect to dynamic tasks such as translation and priming, etc. However, the revised hierarchical model's success has been in its simplicity and its ability to generate testable research hypotheses, which have been employed and tested for several decades after the proposal of this model. So this is all that I wanted to talk to you about in this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture with more information about the relationship between bilingualism and other cognitive functions.